Well, good day. We're now coming to the end of Old Testament introduction, and we will be today looking at the pious history of the historical books. And so, to begin, let us just simply review a little bit about the what we would call the prophetic histories. You remember that we discussed earlier that there was a man by the name of Martin Note who, in his critical studies, came up with a category called Deuteronomistic history. And to just remind you, he noticed that there was a dramatic difference in style between the first four books of the Old Testament, which he called Pentateuch, Genesis through Numbers. And as you know, Genesis has mostly narrative, and then you go into Exodus, which begins with a narrative, but then goes into laws and instructions for constructing the tabernacle. And then you go into Leviticus, which has all the regulations for the tabernacle and the various sacrifices. And then we get into Numbers, where we have the census and then some further narrative as far as bringing the people up to the plains of Moab. On the other hand, Deuteronomy begins on the plains of Moab, but does review the history, but it reviews it in a way within the context of speeches. And so you have at least three speeches of Moses giving the history and exhorting the people to follow the law of God. And then there's also within that the covenant curses and the covenant blessings, and another poem or song, the Song of Moses. So it's a completely different set of work, in that while the other one is looking third person at Israel and everything, here in Deuteronomy you have more of a first person perspective from Moses. So it is a different nature. Now he noticed that different nature, and then he noticed that the Deuteronomistic history, or what he called the Deuteronomistic history, Joshua, Judges, Samuel, and Kings, carried a lot of the themes that were found already in Deuteronomy. So that the themes that are found in Deuteronomy are carried forward and highlighted throughout these books. Now, when we look at the prophetic books in the Tanakh, in the Jewish Old Testament, you will notice that the prophetic books are called there's a category called the former prophets. And the former prophets are Joshua, Judges, Samuel, and Kings. And then, of course, we have the latter prophets, which are Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and the 12, who are the minor prophets. Now, the thing that is interesting here is that the former prophets, we've already discussed why they're called prophetic, but they provide the context for the prophets, that you can take the prophets and put them into context by referencing Samuel, Kings, and placing them in the proper historical context to better understand the message of the various prophetic books. But the big thing that I want you to notice here is that the so-called Deuteronomistic history is equal or exactly the same as the former prophets, that category. Now, when we look at this category of the former prophets, there is this cycle of apostasy that we find, and it's most clear in the book of Judges. But you have where the people are going along, but they start getting lax in their worship of God, and they neglect to teach their children, and they start getting lax on following the word of the Lord. And so they start committing apostasy. They start abandoning. Well, then the Lord sends them an oppressor, sends oppression, somebody who comes and oppresses the people and starts putting them under distress and working and taxing them and basically lording it over them. Well, then the people, after they have been under this oppression, then they begin to experience this distress, and they start getting frustrated with it, so they call out to God for deliverance, and God delivers them. And then this judge comes along and rescues the people. And as long as that judge is alive, the people follow the Lord. We see this cycle clearly stated in the book of Judges. In Judges chapter 2, verses 11 through 23. It kind of begins this way. And the people of Israel did what was evil in the sight of the Lord and served the Baals. And they abandoned the Lord and the God of their fathers, and who had brought them out of the land of Egypt. They went after other gods from among the gods of the peoples who were among them and around them, and bowed down to them. And they provoked the Lord to anger. The Lord abandoned them. They abandoned the Lord and served the Baals and the Asherahs. So the anger of the Lord was kindled against Israel, and he gave them over to plunderers, who plundered them. And he sold them into the hand of their surrounding enemies, so that they could no longer withstand their enemies. Whenever they marched out, the hand of the Lord was against them for harm, as the Lord had warned. And as the Lord had sworn to them, they were in terrible distress. Verse 16, then the Lord raised up judges who saved them out of the hand of those who plundered them. Yet they did not listen to their judges, for they whored after other gods and bowed down to them. They soon turned aside from the way in which their forefathers had walked, who had obeyed the commandments of the Lord. They did not do so. Whenever the Lord raised up a judge for them, the Lord was with the judge, and he saved them from the hand of their enemies all the days of the judge. For the Lord was moved to pity by their groaning because of those who afflicted and oppressed them. But whenever the judge died, they turned back and were more corrupt than their fathers, going after other gods, serving them and bowing down to them. And so we see this cycle going on where the people, as long as there was a judge leading them, they followed the Lord, but then they would start doing things on their own. And you see throughout the Judges a statement that everybody did what was right in their own eyes. And you see that in Judges 17:6, 18:1, 19:1, 21:25. The key verse to think about this is found actually in Deuteronomy chapter 6 in verse 18, which actually begins a little earlier. And it is found here where it basically states that where they're commanded in verse 18, you shall do what is right and good in the sight of the Lord, that it may go well with you, and that you may go in and take possession of the good land that the Lord swore to give to your fathers, by thrusting out all your enemies from before you, as the Lord has promised. And so they were not seeking the Lord. And so what you find happening is that in Samuel, they decide that they don't want the Lord as king, they want a king. And so then the cycle just basically continues, except now they do what is right in the sight of the king, not in the sight of the Lord. And when the king is good, they do what is good, but when the king is bad, they do what is bad. In other words, they just, in place of each seeking the Lord and doing what's right in the Lord's eye, they're doing what is right in the eyes of men. And so that is emphasized throughout this whole history of the the prophetic history. So we kind of, again, as a review, the prophetic history provides the background and context for the prophets. It bridges Deuteronomy to the prophetic books, and it emphasizes how the people, leaders, and kings wandered from God, resulting in showing how the curses in Deuteronomy that you find in Deuteronomy 32 and 31 played out in the history of Israel until they were finally dispossessed completely of the land and the curses were completely fulfilled. Now, the pious histories are different from this. They provide a totally, or I won't say a totally different picture, but they provide a different angle on the history of Israel. First of all, you have the book of Ruth. Now, when you compare the book of Ruth to Judges, you will quickly notice the difference. The book of Judges is a time period where it's a very depressing book historically, where you just see defeat after defeat after defeat. Yeah, there are victories in Judges, but the overall sense is defeat. In fact, at the end of Judges, it's just horrifying what happens at the end of the book of Judges, as the people have forgotten their God and are not really following Him. But on the other hand, in Ruth, you have this faithful remnant, even a lady who is not even actually an Israelite, who turns to God and declares God her God, and how God restores these people, those who have, the beginning of the story is they've left the Lord, and they've lost it all, but God restores Naomi at the end and restores her in spite of everything. And so you find a faithful remnant still following the ways of God, applying the laws of God to their lives, and God blessing. In the time of the judges, no less. Ezra and Nehemiah, you have the people, the remnant, coming back and being restored, but they are no longer a great nation. They're a small province within the Persian Empire, and they're having to navigate the politics of the greater empire in order to reestablish themselves as a people there in the Promised Land. Esther, you have a queen, a courtesan, who is basically kind of she's just a decorative piece at first, but then she ends up being able to save her people in a time of distress there in the Persian kingdom. Finally, you have Chronicles and Kings, 1st and 2nd Chronicles, which compares to Samuel and Kings. It's basically the same history. The difference is that it focuses on Judah. It does record many of the failings of the people and highlights them, but at the same time, you see God working and intervening on behalf of the people of Judah in ways that are not recorded there in Kings. So just a note, just remember that 1st and 2nd Chronicles are the final books, and we talked about that in relation to the Jewish canon and how this helps us establish that the Jewish canon was known to Jesus. Remember, with the first martyr and the last martyr. But the pious histories, as we see, are written mostly during the time of the exile, or during or after the exile, with the exception of Ruth. Ruth may have been written during the time of David. Most scholars kind of push it to that time period, but it's still set in the time of the judges. Then you see that it reassures the people that if they seek God, He will provide in spite of their past failure. In fact, this is where we have that very classic passage that is found in 2nd Chronicles chapter 7, 11 through 18, that if my people will humble themselves and confess their sins, I will restore, I'll heal their land and restore them. And so this is where you have that. That doesn't come out of Kings, but that comes in Chronicles. Then you have it basically assures the faithful remnant of the definiteness of God's promises. And so that is what the basic difference in these books are. They are later books, but their emphasis is, the reason they're not part of the prophetic books is because they're part of the writing, is that they have a different emphasis. And that emphasis is that God is faithful to His faithful remnant in spite of them living in a hostile world. Well, that's all I'm going to share. There will be some more points about the various books that will be found in the outline after this, but this is as far as I'll share this PowerPoint and this recorded lecture for you. Take care, and Lord be with. Bye.